We are live. So here we are. So, Varsha, your stock of bourbon. I have to bring this up quickly. It seems to be dwindling, and I noticed this because it's always right behind you, right? So,
Yeah, I today I have finally finished my bottle of rye, Michter's rye, and it's my
ah,
favorite rye ever, and I'm super sad, but I am happy to be able to drink it on Drinking with Historians to share my last dram with you all. But yes, it is dwindling. I have very little Hudson. I have half the bottle of Hudson left, and I only have like one thing of mixtures left
ooh.
of bourbon, and I'm so sad.
Hmm.
Um,
I feel like I
yeah.
should. I mean, like you always put your liquor on display, like, and I kind of hide behind the virtual background because I'm relegated to the basement when I record these. But I should. I feel like I should do like a live shot of my liquor cabinet, just so people have a sense of what I have
Yeah,
sometimes.
no, we need to see what a professor of the humanities deems worthy of a liquor cabinet. That's what
That's right.
everyone's been asking.
That's right.
Um,
I am a professor of the humanities in Appalachia, so let me tell
yeah,
you, here we
when
are. Yeah.
when when I finally go back to Berkeley, my background is going to be what my background was for comps when I took comps over Zoom, where
Hmm.
literally it was all my liquor bottles and a bookshelf. And like half of the books were books of the people questioning me. So like I was just like, hey, so you wrote this in this book. Yeah. So no, we should introduce our guest. Our guest today is
Oh yeah, I guess we should probably start the episode, shouldn't we? So,
yeah, yeah.
so thank you everyone for joining us on Drinking with Historians. We're on episode 11, I believe, if you can believe it. We are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Carl Shoemaker, who is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And before I say anything else, Varsha, I don't know if you are aware of this. We are all graduates or soon to be graduates of Cal. So go Bears, first of all.
Go
That's right.
Bears. I
Go
also
there.
lived in Madison for 3 years, and my when I was in second grade, my dream college was UW Madison because it was like
Oh,
right down the street.
Mhm.
I used to love Madison, but then I moved to California and became a Californian.
You know, I've been watching Dark, so I know exactly what's happening. It's all interconnected. So, I mean, yeah. Um, anyway, Carl is a. We're so fortunate to have him here. You know, we're going to be talking about lots of really interesting stuff. Maybe stuff that doesn't even relate directly to his research interests, if he's willing to talk about a certain university just up the road from me later on, which has just been in the news very prominently in the last 20 minutes, right? But anyway, before that, I think we have to start with the question we always start with. What are you drinking? I tweeted out earlier, I'm drinking a cocktail called the Handsome Devil. There it is,
Ooh.
which has a whole bunch of lovely ingredients, including whiskey and Lillet Blanc. I use substituted Cochi Americano there, but it has a nice sweet, savory layer because it's quite warm outside where I am. So, Varsha, what are you drinking?
As I mentioned before, I have finally finished my bottle of Michter's rye. This is the last pour I'm gonna get out of it, and it's my favorite rye because it's not as spicy as other ryes, and it's very smooth.
Hmm.
So I really enjoy it. My second favorite rye is also a bottle I finished very quickly, Willet Rye. I don't
Hmm.
have it anymore, and I was actually in DC last summer, and I was just strolling around after the archives. I was just walking down the streets, and I found this liquor store, and I was like, "You should recommend me a bottle." And they're like, "Here is this $60 bottle of rye." And I'm like, "I don't know, 60 seems pretty steep." But then he let me try a little, and I was like, "God damn, I gotta buy this right now." So yeah, I'm a big rye fan. I used to just be a big Scotch person, but I think my whiskey tastes have become more American over the years.
And
Yeah,
that's why we are
Carl,
primed to accept sponsorship from any bourbon or rye maker who is out
this
there.
is what I'm saying.
Varsha,
Yeah,
we are ready to sell out at a moment's notice, so please hit
yep.
us up. Sorry, Carl. What are you drinking?
What are
So,
you drinking, Carl?
well, I have a brand new bottle of Long Branch bourbon, which is made by the
Oh.
Wild Turkey Distillery. I'm not mixing it with anything, but in deference to you guys, I did put it in a glass. So now,
well, I mean, we all have bottles, so it's yeah.
Yeah,
if depending on how things go, I brought backup, which is the bottle of Russell's Reserve Rye, because like Varsha, I'm also a big fan of rye, and I want to plug, just in case the distillers are tuned in, which I assume they are. Also, would any endorsement packages from Booker's Bourbon, which is another favorite of mine. Um,
Ooh.
but I
Hmm.
got to Willet Distillery a couple of summers ago, Varsha, and it was a fantastic distillery tour on the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky. So if you ever get a chance, or if you haven't done it, I recommend it. So,
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
my even though Mitch McConnell lives there, my dream is to go to all the distilleries I can in Kentucky, and then
yeah,
before that, go to as many as I can in Scotland. It's just like that's now my dream vacation. It used to be like Paris, but no, screw that.
We've talked about this, doing a live episode once this all lifts, like maybe at the AHA, but I think another live episode somewhere on the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky is an absolute must do at some point in the future. So,
Yeah.
absolutely.
and then we'll just go to Scotland and then we'll just do,
Yeah.
distilleries up there too. So, so again, hit us up. We're ready to sell out. Okay. But we should probably talk to our guests a little bit more instead of just constantly asking people for money. So, but we're all humanists here. We all know how it is. So Carl, you are a medievalist, so I'm sorry, but also you have this wonderful picture in as your virtual background. Can you tell us a little bit why you chose that and kind of how that kind of relates to what you're interested in?
Oh, I just like telling people off, and I thought this was a really good representation. Uh, you've caught me short. I'm embarrassed. I couldn't even tell you which manuscript this came from.
Oh no, we lost Carl. He'll come back.
That's okay. We'll fill the silence with it. Maybe it was the curators of whatever archive it was. They're sabotaging Zoom from the inside because they wanted proper attribution. There you are. Okay, you're back.
Okay, you're back.
Right.
You're back.
Oh, sorry. I was just explaining. I don't actually know the provenance of this image, but
Okay. Well, we were guessing that the archive had somehow sabotaged your bandwidth to make sure to punish you for not knowing the provenance. So, but anyway, but you work on medieval law, right? And so so an argumentative kind of yell. I mean, that's the image we have of most lawyers, both in the Middle Ages and stuff like that. Raising your fist and kind of yelling at someone. So, but your new project, if I'm remembering correctly, involves a special person who is considered, well, maybe not a person, but someone who is considered a lawyer in the Middle Ages.
yeah. So I've been on this project longer than I'm really care to admit, but I stumbled across this quite by accident some time ago. A lawsuit in which hell sends a demon to represent their interests in heaven rather, and what they're trying to do, what hell wants to do, is sue for recovery of all the souls that were lost during after the crucifixion of Christ, when he descended to hell and liberated the captives there. So it's a kind of class action suit to recover all of these souls that were lost. So hell sends a very learned demon, and he's learned because in later visual representations in the early modern period, he's often shown sort of bespectacled.
The universal sign of learnedness, right? Yeah.
And we can get into this too. There's also a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment in the depictions of this lawyer, because there's lots of plays on the sort of visualization of the religious other in the visual tradition associated with this text. But anyway, the demon was named Mascarone in some of the tradition. He's unnamed in others. Goes to hell and prosecutes this suit to recover all of the human souls that were ever born or will ever be born. And after a sort of dramatic build-up where it doesn't look like anyone's going to appear to speak on behalf of humankind, Mary enters grandly and takes over the lawsuit, the defense of humankind. And the demon objects to this right away. The demon makes two objections that are actually quite grounded in medieval Roman law, which is, one, she can't serve as an advocate because she's a woman, and only men can do that. To which she replies quite rightly that in certain cases, where paupers or other people who fit in a category of the miserable personas that women can speak for them when no one else can. So as a last resort, there's actually a sort of opportunity for her to do so, which is correct. But the demon also says she shouldn't be able to represent or serve as an advocate because she's the mother of the judge, because Christ is sitting as judge in this case. But she responds that she's actually a named defendant in the suit because she's a member of humankind, so she should be able to speak. And this is one of several sort of procedural motions that the demon loses along the way, getting more and more upset, insisting more and more on a strict application of the law, and Mary's responding with sort of equally learned use of the classical legal texts. Several of the manuscripts were clearly used in a pedagogical setting. They were used to teach students procedure in the medieval law schools. So it's been a oh, and the devil loses. I should, the demon loses the case in case you were worried. So,
Naturally.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, but
Yeah.
so. But the way Mary wins the case is really interesting because after making some really sophisticated uses of sort of textual arguments, she abandons that. And the text says that she rips her garments open, exposing her naked body to the court. And she says to Christ as judge, I nursed you from these breasts for 9 months. I carried you in this, I nursed you from these breasts. I carried you in this womb for 9 months. If you find against me, then just delete me from the book of life, right? Just consign me to hell. So there's this kind of wonderfully emotional argument that caps off what had been a fairly rigorous kind of legalism up until this point. This argument is effective over the demon's objections. He's sort of, Christ sends him away in embarrassment and humiliation, and there's some rejoicing. There's a little bit more after that, but that's really the climax of the text. So it's never been translated into English. There hasn't been a lot of scholarly attention given to it. What has been done, some good work has been done from literary scholars, but it hasn't really been done by legal historians. And the reason for that is because 19th century legal historians who knew about the text hated it and said, you shouldn't study it, it's not real law, it has all this preposterous imagery, Mary bares her bosoms, and so they just reject it out of hand. So this is an opportunity to sort of recover a text that I think clearly played a very important part in legal education in the late Middle Ages, but hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
I'm not a lawyer or a legal historian, but wouldn't it is this text useful in, like, for 19th century historians, or 19th century lawyers, even though they hate it, to realize that, like, legal positivism, or the idea that, like, law is just a set of ideas that judges can apply blindly is false? I mean, wouldn't does early 20th century lawyers love it?
That's, as far as I know, they're not really paying attention to it. There's a text that's printed in the UK in 1910 or so, called a legal miscellany, and they do a loose translation of the text off one of the sort of early published versions of it. But this question of legal positivism is really interesting because the most absolutely legal positivist aspects in the text are not from the devil. They're actually from Christ, who says some really astonishing things from a jurisprudential standpoint. At one point, the demons made an objection. Christ says, I have founded the laws and I give them authority. The laws do not give authority to me. And this is a really, from a jurisprudential standpoint, a medieval lawyer reading this would have said, whoa, because a lot of late medieval legal thought is precisely trying to figure out how to bind the sovereign under law. And so this sort of casual assertion and a procedural motion that, and from a theological standpoint, this also had some really important resonance. So the theologians, some of whom were completely on board this kind of vision of God being able to, anything God does is just, versus a sort of more Thomistic notion that, God himself is bound in some way by justice. These were really live discussions, and the text is putting them on display in really interesting ways. But the early modern legal historians who are reading this, they don't like it because the text is really messy from a procedural standpoint. It's the wrong venue. The judge, Christ can't be judge. He's an interested party, right? There's a lot of things they don't like about it from a purely technical standpoint. And what's interesting is I think the guys, the men who were using this text to teach and were learning from it in the 13th and 14th century, they recognized these problems. That was part of the point. You were supposed to be able to recognize these problems. But,
Yeah, like problem one, Christ should be recusing himself because he seems to have a vested interest in this case. I don't know.
yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Fortunately, today, living in the 21st century, we can congratulate ourselves on having moved so far past that kind of backward
Oh
stuff.
yeah, our legal system is a beacon of progress in the United States. We have no corrupt judges whatsoever.
Yes.
No, and no conflicts of interest, nothing, right? Like
None.
it's just
Yeah.
just perfect. So
Yeah. I mean,
just
you didn't put the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing on that poll you sent out, but we could talk about that too.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. I was going to
Well-
mention something about the Federalist Society, but we don't have to talk about them.
Hey, no topics off limits on Drinking with Historians. We can make fun of anybody. I'm curious though. I mean, you mentioned this, a couple times. Is this particular text as a teaching text, right? And then the betrayal, it kind of it grinds against some popular kind of conceptions about the Middle Ages, right? Portraying the demon or the devil as adhering to a set of principles, right? Is that in some ways I would think that you're supposed to sympathize, like you said, like there are procedural problems with kind of what's going on, and no. Ultimately, at the end of the day, right, you're gonna want Mary and to succeed and to Christ to rule in a certain type of way. But at the same time, like portraying the devil as having like a good argument, that's something that we don't often associate with the Middle Ages. Like, so how does that work?
Yeah, and that's a great question. In fact, the whole notion of due process is something that a lot of 20 and 21st century jurists and historians alike sort of congratulate themselves for. We have it, and it was we didn't have it in the earlier age, and there's been this sort of progress. But the incredibly careful attention to due process concerns in the text I study is really evident, and in fact, it comes up in a way because some of the leading jurists would say things like, even if the devil wanted to be heard, he would have to be heard. So, in other words, due process applies to all the creatures of God, and that there's no one can be excluded from their opportunity to be heard, right? And that's a really powerful principle, and we like to congratulate ourselves that our constitutional order is grounded on this, even as we see it trampled sort of routinely. But that's deeply ingrained in medieval understandings of what justice required, and so I do chafe a little bit when I tell people I do medieval law and they respond with, "Oh, did they have law then?" and that sort of. And yeah, they did a lot of it. You bet you. So, and due process, as I said, a deeply grounded concern in this area. It might not look like we expect, but it's there.
So I guess kind of a follow-on question like that is that like so what got you interested in this type of stuff? Is that historians aren't kind of sprung from the ground as historians who are interested in their particular thing. So so what kind of got you interested, kind of like legal history or just kind of history in general? Was it something kind of an undergraduate? Was it something even before then?
Well, I was an undergraduate at Liberty University, so we can't really talk about. Well, first of all, we can't talk about alcohol because that's strictly forbidden. But but it's not a place you go to get an academic grounding, right? It's a very particular kind of place meant to protect young evangelicals from the world around them. And its failures to do so are somewhat evident at this point. So I went to Liberty. This is how clueless I was about what I wanted to do. I went to Liberty and I majored in business, right? I mean, I didn't. So I don't have a legitimate undergraduate degree, nor do I have a legitimate major, nor did I go to a legitimate institute. But I didn't know any of that at the time because the evangelical world was, all that I knew at that point. So when I went to law school later, that was, again, a decision I made with a tremendous amount of ignorance. based on the fact that that's in the mid 90s, that's what everybody was doing. You go to law school, if you had some success in undergrad, you go to law school, and then you make a living. So even in law school, I thought I was going to practice law. I'd returned to Alabama, where I was born. I thought I was going home. I thought I was going to set up for a legal career there. And it was really only in law school that I began to think about the possibility of doing something other than law practice. And the way that came about in part was I was working on a case my firm took where a judge in a neighboring county had been taken to displaying the Ten Commandments on the wall in his courtroom. So this was Judge Roy Moore in his early phase as a circuit court judge in the state of Alabama. And so I think I'm a second year law student. I've already accepted an offer from this firm. This firm is deeply plugged into the conservative political movement in Alabama, but it wasn't a public interest firm, right? We were doing insurance defense stuff. And this case comes along in which it's a First Amendment case. So the ACLU sued Judge Moore. The state hired us to defend him. And I get to read all this great stuff from the 18th century, the 19th century, trying to figure out if there's a constitutionally protected right to display the Ten Commandments in a courtroom or lead the jury pool in prayer, which is something else he was doing. And so I realized a few things doing this. One is I'm never going to have a case as interesting as this. I'm never going to be writing research briefs on 18th century jury practice like I was doing for this. And so, there were other things sort of pushing me to start thinking about an academic path, but that was really an important part of it. And that whole case really just soured me on the trajectory I had been on, which was one that was pretty deeply involved in conservative politics at least at the state level in Alabama. And when you see how that sausage is made, grad school actually looks really, really appealing. So,
Wow. The few things grad school is better than conservative legal practice in Alabama. Excellent.
I worked for, this feels almost confessional at this point. I'm confessing all my crimes, but I worked not just Roy Moore, but I did research for Jay Sekulow, who's now one of Trump's personal lawyers, but at the time was running this outfit called the American Center for Law and Justice, which was meant to be a conservative answer to the ACLU. And just one thing I'll say about that case is when you grow up in an evangelical community, you have the ACLU figures really large in your imaginary as this sort of capacious organization out trying to snatch religious freedoms from people. And when I'm working on this case for Roy Moore, right, the state's hired my firm. I worked with some very bright, very accomplished lawyers. There was a senior partner, an associate, and then the new hire, me, all three of us working on this case around, every day for weeks. And the ACLU was represented by two sole practitioners who were working pro bono, right? They were doing this they were sharing photocopiers and doing this work, after their regular work was done. So it was really a David and Goliath kind of situation from a standpoint of resources, and we were Goliath. Right? And so doing this, I'm like, the ACLU is not actually this frightening, sort of global hegemonic institution. It's just a bunch of people who care about issues, who are doing their best to engage. And that was a really eye-opening moment for me because, we had the governor of Alabama, cutting red tape to approve that our firm would receive, market rate for the work we were doing. It was really, there was some really interesting things about the whole case. And it became pretty clear early on that this was Roy Moore's attempt to launch himself into state politics, not really about them. So.
Yeah. So your interest in the devil as a lawyer makes much more sense now. Yeah. Maybe it is kind of like you said, like a confessional kind of atonement or something like that, or maybe it's just you like recognizes like or something like that. I don't know. But so when you bring this, we tend to think. There aren't a lot, well, maybe there are, but people don't think of legal history as kind of an active, or at least maybe not all of us, as kind of an active thing that students are kind of attracted to. So, what do you enjoy teaching? What are your students kind of most attracted to? What kind of courses do you teach? What do you love teaching and bringing to the students in order to kind of get them excited about this like you were? So.
Yeah, so
not everybody can defend Roy Moore in court. So yeah.
Yeah.
Now I've lost you.
Oh, I was just
Yeah,
going to say, like, not
um,
everybody can defend Roy Moore. So yeah.
Yeah.
well, yeah, I think that's an increasingly smaller and smaller circle. Um, So one course I really, really love teaching is a course that I've been doing for a long time, and it's actually a course I kind of modeled after something that a professor at Berkeley, a law prof named Michael Smith, taught. It's called the History of Punishment, and
Mm,
I've he started with the ancient world. He taught ancient Greek text, biblical text, Dante's Inferno, and then up through sort of 21st century sociology. I've made it much more focused on the medieval period, and put in a lot more. I do a little bit with Antigone as a kind of opener for the
mm,
course. But then the primary sources and the stuff that I really want to sort of get into turn out to be mostly medieval stuff. And then for the modern period, I have them read a couple of contemporary Supreme Court cases which have direct ties to live issues of medieval jurisprudence. Can you execute someone who's insane, for example, which was a question that
mm,
lawyers were asking.
yeah.
Uh, and it gives me an opportunity to sort of link up over long periods of time some of these issues for the students to think about. That's a course I really enjoy. I've been teach a course called The History of the Common Law, which focuses more on the English common law development. Um, I spend a lot. I try to work the ordeal, the divine ordeal, into every class I teach. Even when I teach evidence in the law school, I start with the ordeal because, God damn it. Uh, but yeah, I think the history of punishment is pretty clearly my favorite one. And it doesn't, the history of punishment doesn't sell, the title doesn't sell itself as a legal history course, so that they're not explicitly as a legal history course. So maybe that gets some students who might, might otherwise not get in. But that's a really fun course to teach. And I teach in a lecture. Well, I used to teach in a lecture format. God knows how going forward how it'll be taught.
So I mean, that's one of the things, I think that a lot of people are curious about, and I even got some emails about this, like wanting to ask you about this, and knowing kind of your background and stuff like that, is about like these lines of continuity. Is that between the medieval and kind of the modern, and you talked a little bit about this with that particular source with about this idea of due process, and people think this is a modern conceit, and like no, there's actual, but also I think when people want to do shoddy history in order to make political points, they'll say something like, "Oh, well, even way back in the Middle Ages, they were doing this, or they weren't doing this, or something like that." So, kind of, how do you engage that? And what Varsha was saying about kind of the eternal nature of the law, these kind of conceptions of that. So, how do you kind of talk about that, like historical change over time, but also showing or thinking about kind of this boogeyman of historians, like relevance.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I think every historian at some level has to choose at some basic level. We choose whether we do continuity or whether we do disruption, right? And I've been more drawn towards disruption for sure. And I think that's actually a really useful way of talking about these relationships. But one way to answer your question, I try to invert that problem. And one way I invert it is through the work I did on sanctuary protections. Say, okay, you
Mm,
want to talk about modern progress? Let me show you an age in which the downtrodden, the persecuted, criminals, murderers, the worst people you can think of, could go in a church and receive a fairly absolute protection from arrest, from violence. Where the sort of day-to-day concerns with law and order were completely suspended in in honor of a range of commitments about what was due to the sacred, a range of commitments about what royal authority owed to ecclesiastical institutions, right? So for 1500 years, right, the first 1500 years of Christianity, you could fully expect this kind of protection in a church. We're kind of unique and would look barbaric if you want to put it in this framework for not recognizing or respecting those kinds of protections. Now I'm not making a claim that we should restore the medieval sanctuary practices that I wrote about in the book, but I do think it's a really interesting way to talk. I'm not saying I'm opposed either,
just throwing that out there,
but it's a way of thinking about these kinds of relationships, and it's a way of chipping away at this kind of conceit that there was this backward dark age, and we've freed ourselves from all these superstitions, and today we have reason and we have due process. And
Yeah. So
Yeah.
should we hop over to Q&A, or do you have a
Yeah,
question? Sorry.
No, there's just some really, really amazing questions in the Q&A. So I just wanted to start with one that I know is from a lawyer. So Ian asks, was there any analog to substantive due process in medieval law? So he's wondering, was there a notion that there were certain subject matters that were beyond the reach of the law in the medieval period? Or was everything fair game in the medieval period as it sort of is today?
wow, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I don't know if I can do it justice in the context of this not podcast. One of them, I think, has to do with due process. I think, across the range of juristic opinions you'll find in the medieval text, and they are just legion, is a bedrock commitment to the idea that everyone has an opportunity to be heard in a judicial venue, and that a certain set of protections attached to that opportunity to be heard. Yeah, absolutely. So, was there a substantive due process component in the way in which lawyers talk about substantive due process today? That's a really good question. I almost want to say sanctuary rights are one, because while you would find people who say you can only have sanctuary if you were a Christian or you had to convert to receive sanctuary, there was a pretty strong sense that having an immunity to violence, whether it's private violence or state violence, as long as you were within a church or its precincts or the cemetery or the bishop's house, or maybe the bishop while he's in transit and you find him on the highway, maybe even he counts. That's a pretty.
Oh, we lost you. The question was just too much for him, Matt.
it just this is big archive. It's big archive sabotaging
Bandwidth.
Carl's discussion. So
yeah,
hopefully we'll get him back in
just
a second. So yeah, I'm not concerned. It gives you perfect time to kind of pour in a little bit more drink for the happy hour if you want to. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But there are some really good questions. I think I'm going to ask Carl next what the divine ordeal is, because Vicky and a couple of other people are confused as to what the divine ordeal actually is.
No, and I think there's some really, we keep getting amazing questions, and I think like just to kind of pull the veil back off kind of how we do this is that, we see all your questions and then we just try to get to as many as possible as we can. And we just have so many wonderful ones that it's absolutely impossible in the time that we have. A lot of really great questions too about the medieval source that Carl was talking about kind of like where did it come from? What's the transmission? I wanted to ask, and I just kind of got lost in the conversation because it was so rich and interesting about the visual representations. Like have those always been part of the manuscript tradition? Because sometimes as historians we think about the text as just existing as text and not as kind of existing within like a manuscript and like with pictures and words and scribbles and stuff like that. So. Carl, you're back.
Yeah, Carl is back. You're muted, Carl, but you're back. Okay, cool. So I was gonna ask. So a couple of people have wondered, because I don't think they're medievalists. What is the divine ordeal?
Oh my! The divine ordeal is my favorite thing. The divine ordeal was a mode of trial where someone was accused of something and was asserting their innocence, in which that claim of innocence could be tested in a couple of ways. One way was to lower their body into a pool of water that had been blessed by a priest, so the water was holy. And if they submerged, this was evidence that the water had received them, and therefore they were innocent, and they would be taken out. But if they bobbed on top and floated, the water was rejecting them, in which case they were clearly guilty. Or if you didn't like that, you could carry a hot iron of some prescribed number of steps, and then they would examine the burns to see if they were healing cleanly or festering, in which case your guilt or innocence would be determined by your body, right? So so
Yeah.
these practices were observed in Europe for a period of 400 decisive moment. The papacy, Pope Innocent III, forbid priests from participating in this practice, and therefore making it very hard to conduct the ordeal, because the priest was the sort of linchpin of the whole thing, blessing the iron, blessing the water. Now, this wasn't just pulled away willy-nilly. Pope Innocent III had a very specific sort of legal reforms that were put in place to replace the ordeal, in which the judge was given a tremendous amount of authority to call witnesses, to examine witnesses, to bring charges, to operate even on rumor and innuendo, and even in some cases to use torture to extract information from witnesses or from the accused. We call this the Inquisition, and it's a mode of legal process that exists under that same kind of name even through today. And for about 500 years, the modes of torture, judicial torture, and other things attached to it were fairly commonplace in Europe. It even goes a different way at this point. It's going to make a claim for English exceptionalism. It happens around this point where they start using the jury to make these determinations rather than an inquisitorial legal process. So the jury predates 1215, but the jury really sort of hits its stride at precisely this moment when it takes over the guilt-finding tasks that the ordeal had performed prior to that. So
Was the ordeal, I mean, just kind of a follow-up on this is that was the ordeal, sorry, I had some bourbon, I apologize. Was the ordeal, was that something that was restricted to kind of canon law courts, or was it prevalent in Roman law or common law courts as well? Or was it widespread, or was it much more narrowly, not just kind of geographically?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. Some of the first evidence we have for use of the ordeal is some Carolingian epistolaries, in which Charlemagne is saying, look, the results of the ordeal are to be adhered to, it must be followed, which gives you a really strong indication that the ordeal was not terribly well liked or followed. And we know that from the get-go, municipalities and other institutions in Europe were trying to get immunities so they didn't have to use the ordeal. It was very unpopular in urban centers. Its practice seems to be more associated with more rural and pastoral areas. Jewish communities in Europe before the great expulsions of the 13th century get immunities against the ordeal right away. But it's widespread enough. I mean, none of the intellectual elite, the canonists don't really like it. Roman law says nothing about the ordeal. Roman law says if you want to find out the truth of a problem, ask witnesses, get documents, right? This sort of weird kind of faith and empiricism. But canon law there were some early medieval texts which either allowed or even endorsed use of the ordeal. So the canonists were at a bit of a spot because their texts were conflicting about the use of the ordeal. But by 1215, the sort of weight of learned opinion had turned. I'm not saying this is why the ordeal was abolished, but clearly the intellectual elite of Europe at the time, the university-trained types, didn't like it. And the Inquisition was really attractive because this gave you a way better way to get in and control what people were thinking about, how they were thinking about it, heresy. Like the ordeal's not really good at rooting out heresy, right? An Inquisition is good at rooting out heresies. The ordeal it had its doubters, shall we say.
Yeah. There's a really cool question from Christian. He asks how well, so like we know that this lawsuit is used as like a teaching text, like a pedagogical text, but how well is it known like outside of the legal circles during the period it's released? And is it seen more as like an allegory, or is it something that's like a truth that like Mary's role in an intervention for mankind is much bigger than that had previously been assumed?
Yeah. And can I follow up on that? Because there's other questions too. Could you talk a little bit more about the text? Like, do we know who wrote it? Like, when is it from? Like, what's the transmission about? Like, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
With the caveat that everybody should buy Carl's book when it comes out. So
yes, when it comes out.
Yes.
Yeah. So those are fantastic questions. So the text appears what I think is sort of the high watermark of Marian devotion, where she, her role in Christian theology is really, really at a sort of fever pitch, right? And so there's an entire life for this text that exists outside the law schools. Theologians, ecclesiastics are sending it to each other, saying, this is why they call Mary our advocate, right? So, and these texts don't have any of the apparatus of the legal citations. It exists more like a devotional text, and it'll appear occasionally in collections of Marian devotion that are completely independent from the manuscript collections, where it appears with lots of legal documents. So it has at least two lives. And I think one of the things interesting about it is that it's a nexus point where the cosmology behind medieval law and the cosmology behind medieval Christian theology meet perfectly. That the justice of God is put on display in a way that's pleasing to both theologians and lawyers alike. And Mary's role is completely natural within the context of late 13th, early 14th century Christian theology anyway. There's a sort of bringing her to the front and center of the redemption story in a way that is not nearly as pronounced in, say, later Protestant Christianity. So we don't know who wrote the text. The trial scene itself actually is pulled out of some courtly literature, some Arthurian stories, where a demon thinks that because hell thinks they can defeat God through his own justice. They send this demon, and when he loses the case, hell gets really upset and decide, screw it, we're going to have our own human incarnated on earth. So they send a demon who's capable of procreating, and he impregnates a human woman, and that child in the Arthurian legends is Merlin, right? So that's where the story comes out of comes out of a courtly literature tradition. Someone, and I don't know who, cuts that trial scene out of the Arthurian materials and probably translates it back into Latin from a vernacular, which is really, really interesting. So because we have early Dutch, early Catalonian, the French come a little later, but there's a number of vernacular versions of this text that exist by the 14th century. But a Latin version, sort of standing alone, just the trial scene, starts to get circulated. There are 45 extant versions of this manuscript, and that's a lot for medieval texts. That's like, to put it in perspective, something like the corpus of canon law, like Gratian's Decretum, only exists in about 540, 550 manuscripts. So it's big, and it's not as big as some of the biggest legal texts, but it's hugely popular. So it's circulating. It's circulating with theologians. It's circulating with the jurists. It's very popular in early printed collections. When the printing press comes along, there's a number of incunable versions of it. So it travels really widely. The Reformation seems to be a point where people lose interest in it. It seems it's a little too Catholic.
Yeah. So that leads me to two questions, that are sort of separate but related. So Patrick asks, what is medieval law? What makes medieval law medieval? When does it end? And so is it the Reformation? Is it something else? And then my second related question is, somebody asks, how did studying medieval literature or the medieval period affect your experience with evangelicalism, if you want to answer that? Did we lose you or no?
Yeah. So I think I got most of that. Okay. That's a great prelim question, right? When is medieval? the clearest answer is that there's a set of fairly well-defined texts that come out of classical Roman law, which are sort of revitalized in the Middle Ages and become a really important sort of site of study for the excavation of principles about law, governance, administration. And alongside this, within the Catholic Church, a range of texts emerge which sort of govern the kinds of governance issues that exist within an ecclesiastical structure. And those two things sort of stand as pillars, as the sort of medieval legal tradition. And now I've just excluded from that an incredibly wide range of early medieval legislation, vernacular legal traditions, sort of practices that don't sort of get invited within the walls of the university. And none of my answer is meant to exclude those things, but when we talk about medieval legal history, that's kind of the sort of the foundation of it, and then people move off into different areas of it. My break, if I understood the last part of that question, my break with evangelical Christianity didn't, occurred before I really sort of got immersed in medieval stuff. The scales fell off my eyes on the way to Damascus, just going the other direction than St. Paul, I guess, a little bit earlier. But it's impossible to disentangle these things. So I'm really well aware when I'm studying medieval theology that there's a sort of orientation I have in the back of my mind that's deeply Calvinist in ways. And what I try to do is be aware of that, and also use it to bring light to as much, sort of unique light to these problems as I can.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point, and before, one of the things. So I teach, though I'm a historian by training, I teach in history from a straight history department. I teach in a religion department now, and so one of the things we attract they're slightly different students, and so having a conversation with them on the first day is about, we're going to be talking about these kind of specific themes, and if they impact you in a personal way, that's fine, but that's not. The point of what we're trying to do is we're just trying to talk about kind of what the past is like, when we're talking about the Middle Ages, and that impacts people in kind of different ways and engenders kind of different conversations. So I think it's really interesting too, that, you're highlighting, like, as we talked about at the very beginning, like historians don't kind of spring out of the ground. There's different paths, and we've seen this throughout, different ways that people kind of get into becoming historians, either formal or informal. So. And so kind of related to that, since it's kind of related to graduate school and law school and stuff like that, I wanted to ask you about torture. So see how natural that segue was? So, this is a true professional right here. So lots of questions about judicial torture. That's absolutely one kind of stereotype we have about the Middle Ages, is that torture is widespread. It is used all the time in order to enact things. Like what can you say about kind of the use of torture in the medieval judicial setting?
Yeah, so it's, I think this is true in an entire range of legal history topics that we've been talking about, but there's a real danger in allowing ourselves to read the early modern and modern critique of the Middle Ages into our source material. So, one of the things legal historians have been pointing out for several decades now is that some of the sort of harshest voices that come out of medieval texts, the judge who's, sort of law and order, hang them all in his text, when we look at what they're actually doing, when we have records and we can look at, what's going on in this or that place, some of those same judges are often granting pardons right and left, sort of, being incredibly, granting an incredible amount of latitude. So there's definitely a way in which you have to sort through whether the textual evidence you have tracks what's happening on the ground when we know. Right. So, 13th century English criminal law is incredibly brutal. You mostly get executed for any slight offense, except they're actually not executing that many people. There were lots and lots of ways, even if you were captured and prosecuted, there were just lots of built-in sort of escape valves, and then there were sort of escape valves you could manufacture for yourself. Running to the church being one of the most obvious ones. So that question is, invites us, I think, to think about the distinction between the sort of sharp teeth of medieval law that we see in the text, in conjunction with the sort of way in which it's often the judicial system, I use that term loosely, that is withholding the powers that it claims quite a bit, and might be withholding them because the legitimacy of these practices actually depended on not being nearly as violent and capacious as the text might lead us to believe.
So kind of following up on that, I mean, so one of the things that one of the common conversations we're having right now is not just about policing, but about imprisonment, right? And talking about kind of things like that. So can you say anything about other forms of judicial punishment in the Middle Ages? Does anything in the Middle Ages kind of speak to today's conversation about prison abolition or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what the Roman lawyers, and I mean that the classical Roman lawyers coming out of antiquity, what they have to say about imprisonment is you can't do it. It's inhumane and horrible, right? So the same people that would throw you off of a high cliff or drown you in the river or crucify you thought imprisonment was a bridge too far. That's right?
Oh.
Yeah.
So it's not that there weren't prisons in the Middle Ages. There were lots of prisons used for detention pre-trial, but in the level of high politics, yes, people are being walled up in the Tower of London for the rest of their lives, for sure. But
sure.
The use of imprisonment as a punishment rather than as a detention before trial is not part of medieval law enforcement. And that the English law doesn't have as much to say about these questions of the conditions of confinement, but the classical Roman law text had a lot to say about imprisonment, and none of it was good. They so and I think that would be a really interesting conversation to have in the context of contemporary discussions of abolition. What are the alternatives? Because history offers us an interesting range of alternatives.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I don't want to go too far with this, but I heard somebody once describe the Romans as kind of like vengeful, petty 12-year-old boys, in their kind of legal thinking. Like you said, they'll throw people off cliffs, they'll crucify people, but for them to say you can't lock people up, that's just a bridge too far. And then here we are having constructed our entire punitive system around that. Wow, that's something right there. So sorry, Varsha, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask, so
yeah,
based on, so this is not relating to contemporary society at all, but somebody asks, does the idea of the devil as lawyer become associated as with the legal profession with this text, or is that something that comes later, right? People generally, I don't hold this opinion, but for a long time people generally have very negative opinions about lawyers, just very anti-Semitic views about lawyers. Do you think this text assists in that or draws away from that? What do you think people in the medieval period think about the legal profession, and how does this text contribute to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The sort of medieval opprobrium, disapproval of lawyers predates this text. I think it certainly contributes to sort of, I have no doubt that some judges reading this text in the 13th century readily thought of litigious individuals they knew when they were looking at this demon, sort of insisting on his legal rights. But there's a much older sort of tradition of hating lawyers. My all-time favorite is a poem that I think is credited to the year 1201. It's a Latin poem, but it says essentially, what can I say about a lawyer? Some say he is like a vile whore, but in fact he's much worse, because while a whore only leases her ass, the lawyer sells his tongue, right? So
No.
This is one of my, I like this one. I like to give this to my grad students in Latin and then have them translate it. So there's a long tradition of
Disliking
thinking
lawyers.
of lawyers.
Yeah, I like the long drag of bourbon after that. That was nice. Another question a bunch of people had, you know, and we're rapidly running out of time, unfortunately, is if you could talk a little bit more about sanctuary. Where did the idea of sanctuary come from? And I remember too is you know, especially at the very beginning of the Trump presidency, is that there was kind of a robust conversation about churches and sanctuary again, like, in which so could you kind of talk through about like what is medieval sanctuary and like why were people talking about it in 2016 with kind of the Muslim ban and kind of these deportations and stuff like that? So.
Yeah. So taking refuge within temples and other religious spots or sacred places predates Christianity. And one of the really favorite things that I found researching the book is that when early Christian communities were trying to figure out how to regulate these kinds of issues, they were fully aware of the practice of sanctuary and pagan temples throughout the Greek Empire, throughout Roman lands. Probably predates the Greeks. Ancient Egypt probably, you know, had these practices for sure. But when the early Christian communities confronted this, their answer wasn't, well, that's a pagan practice we have to abandon. Their response was to say, if the false gods grant this kind of protection, how much more protection should Christianity as the true religion grant? So they took it as an invitation. This is a number of early Episcopal councils say these kinds of things. There's no question for them that sanctuary is something that they would somehow relegate to a pagan past. This is something that they embrace pretty deeply and embrace in a way that puts them in a stance of resistance towards imperial authority for a long time. And some prominent early Christian figures put themselves at great risk to do this. So there's kind of just a built-in assumption that of course you offer these protections. Who wouldn't? And I mean, in the first couple of chapters of the book, I try to trace out the sort of range of Christian, but also Roman patristic traditions, as well as secular traditions that tie into this. But it has this incredibly long afterlife, or you know, maybe it's a nuclear half-life, right? I mean, sanctuary is not sort of actively suppressed in Europe until the 16th century. It's really an early modern story when they finally get around to either outright abolishing or just restricting the number of crimes for which you can have sanctuary. That's a really late story. My book finishes in 1550, so it's, you know, it goes quite a way.
Wow. Yeah. Well, we are running out of time. We're actually out of time. So I just wanted to quickly wrap up by saying thank you. I've learned so much about medieval law that I did not know. And it's very cool to think that like the devil came this close to winning a court case and, you know, securing all of humanity forever. I'm
in front of Jesus and against Mary. Yeah. Like, I mean,
exactly. Wild story. Yeah. They should make a TV show about that. Instead, we had 15 seasons of Supernatural. Like I'm wild. I'm just saying, like I love Supernatural, but nothing comes close to the real thing. So my last question for you is, do you know when the book is coming out and when I can pre-order it?
You just became the chair of my department, Varsha, and I resent you deeply. The manuscript currently has about 150 pages I would call finished, but it's probably 2/3 done. So we'll see. Hopefully soon. I'm eager to get it done.
Okay, you heard it here, folks. Soon. You heard it here first, folks. The book is coming out soon. Thank you for joining us. This was so much fun. And you know, if you ever need a lawyer, hire Mary, the Virgin. She seems really good at her job.
Undefeated.
Undefeated. 100%. Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you, everyone. Please join us next week. Our guest will be Christopher McKnight Nichols from Oregon State University. He'll be talking about the flu pandemic of 1918-19, American exceptionalism, foreign policy, and all sorts of stuff like that. Back into the American stuff, which is like Varsha's thing. It's not like my thing. So. But we've done medieval stuff for a while, so that's okay. Thank you so much for Carl for joining us. Everyone, have a wonderful Friday afternoon. Have a wonderful weekend, and cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.